Looks like it's working well.
Yeah. It says waiting for Chicago Audible. Sure you didn't schedule it?
Looks like live over here. 29 seconds going strong with no viewers.
Anyone? Technology. Oh, we're live.
We're live?
Yep, took a minute.
Sweet. I think I'm in camera.
We can wait and find out. We want to rush, right? I'm excited though. Back to the combine.
Back to the combine, making it work.
Yeah, that's our framing. Take it.
We're gonna take it.
All right. Welcome back, Bears fans, to another episode of the Chicago Audible. It's Tuesday, March 1st, and we're here at the 2022 NFL Scouting Combine to kick off our full week of coverage from a Bears perspective. I'm Russell Dewitt. Joined with me is my co-host Nicholas Moreano. And Nick, this is awesome. You and I have been kind of gushing over this all day. Being back at the combine. It's the first time the NFL's had the combine since 2020. We were there, and it weirdly feels like we were here yesterday, yet an entire lifetime ago.
Absolutely. Like when we got here, just all the memories from the last time we were here, just kind of, we were here. We were, just all the little things that we did. But it feels normal, which it feels great, to be completely honest, just being back around, working, just seeing, guys from the beat as well. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun being down here for sure.
It's a lot of fun. Now, we still have to wait to talk to players. That'll begin tomorrow as we get to talk to some wide receivers and tight ends. But today, we did have the opportunity to talk to and listen to both GM Ryan Poles and head coach Matt Eberflus. And Nick, before we get going, do you just have like a theme that you kind of took away from today? I have a couple that I know will kind of guide our conversation, but I'm just curious. I know we came from a regime that we didn't get a lot of anything. There wasn't a lot of substance. I thought we got some today, given the parameters that we kind of knew was coming.
Yeah, I mean, look, Ryan Poles, Matt Eberflus both started off like, hey, we can't say too much on the details and things like that. But I think the main takeaway for me is that truly Matt Eberflus, Ryan Poles, this Bears organization, everybody involved in it are on the same page in terms of how they're viewing, it could be anything, to be completely honest. There just seems to be that cohesiveness that I think wasn't really there in the last regime, but you hear what Matt Eberflus might be saying, and it's like, Ryan Poles mentioned something very similar, maybe the exact same phrasing. So just people being on the same page, and that starts from the top with those two guys, and definitely going to be reflected to the bottom of this team.
100%. There's a lot of just, I would say, cohesion between the messages, and it felt like obviously they prepare what they want to tell us here today, but I do buy a lot of what they were kind of giving us throughout this morning and this afternoon. And Nick, I want to kind of begin the show by just kind of getting some of those takeaways from both Coach Flus and Poles about this culture that they are establishing here in Chicago. Obviously, whenever a new regime takes over, that is almost priority number one. Poles on the mindset. One of the quotes that he said was, he wants players that wants their name etched inside of the stadium. And then Coach Eberflus talked about as well, when they're looking at players to bring to Chicago, like number one, do they have a deep desire to be great? And are they also willing to work hard? Do you think that this is real and this is substantive, or is this just general GM head coach talk?
Well, I think it needs to be real, because those are the type of players that ultimately are going to be brought into this team, in a couple of months, whether it's free agency or through the draft. But those are the type of, traits that Matt Eberflus, Ryan Poles, they want to bring into this new era of Bears football. So, yeah, you might hear a lot of GMs and head coaches say very similar things, but this is real to them, and that's what they value. So I think there is something to it, especially early on. That's kind of what you're really looking for in these players.
Right, and I think this is why Ryan Poles had that conviction to hire a Matt Eberflus, because they do have this shared vision of how they want to build this Chicago Bears football team. And I know I talked about they want to bring in guys. I know Matt Eberflus mentioned when they're looking at the draft as well as free agent potential targets, like what kind of guys do we want to bring in? And coach said two things. If they two check marks. Number one, do they want to be great? And number two, are they willing to work hard, as I mentioned? And if they don't even check both of those boxes, like they're already discarded. Like they're not even going to be considered to become a Chicago Bear, whether it be through the draft or free agency. So those are the top two kind of priorities that they're putting in place in these players. And then if they do check those boxes, then like, okay, let's scout this player a little bit further. I love that. I don't know about you, but I love that kind of mindset because it's going to kind of weed out some players that, maybe on the surface would be decent options from like a production standpoint, but not so much for the culture that they're trying to build here.
Yeah, and they also talked about like the profiles that they wanted to have on these players. So that again, that kind of fits into exactly this whole entire team being on the same page, and there's no discrepancy of what they're looking for in a player. If he meets XYZ, and maybe it's a need for that position, it's like those are the guys you're going to go pursue. So you're not wasting time. With everything going to be just escalating so quickly, it's like they're not wasting time on players that don't fit their mold. And again, I think that helps, I guess, move the process forward in a good, timely fashion because everything's going to be happening so quickly.
100%. And I think it's refreshing. You mentioned the player profiles, and what Coach Eberflus mentioned was that they went ahead and made a series of tapes on every single position, offense, defense, special teams, and it kind of outlines and depicts the prototype player at each position that they would like to have on this roster. And that'll allow both, the entire coaching staff as well as the scouting department and the front office to kind of have a shared vision. And there's just no way you can misunderstand what someone's looking for because it's right there on tape. You can go see it. These are the attributes, these are the types of players, and everyone's on the same page. To me, again, that's refreshing because it's so easy to kind of misconstrue something, take something a little bit differently. It happens all the time in the world.
Yep.
But to put something out there on tape and say, this is what we want to have, go get it, and go coach this up, it just, to me, makes it, almost like a black and white line that's been drawn and will help this Bears team as they kind of go through their blueprint this offseason to kind of recalibrate, I think, quicker than if they just wouldn't have had that approach at all.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to this, Will, to take the conversation a little bit, continuing with the roster makeup, like Ryan Poles was kind of asked about, since you don't have any attachments to this roster and trying to make up, who's ultimately going to be here, what does that do for a final decision? And he said like it's easier to make those decisions. And the quote that he has, like, see the roster for what the tape is telling you. Kind of like what you were talking about here, making those decisions definitive. And you're doing that because you don't have an attachment to a Danny Trevathan or other guys. But like when you heard that, well, like who are some of those players that you can fit that mold of like what the tape is telling them?
Well, that's a great question, and I do want to mention too that they said they looked at tape from last year and years prior, so they're not going to solely judge a player on what they were able to do a year ago. But the big one, and maybe that's pun intended, would be an Eddie Goldman, because moving into a 3-tech defensive lineman, we had that talk in a podcast last week. Like, I don't believe he is a true fit there. And Coach Sleuth did say for someone in the 3-tech, the priorities are to win your one-on-one matchups, and when they run zone away from you need to hold down that B gap. I think Eddie Goldman can hold a gap. But yeah. I don't believe that he can consistently win, one-on-ones. I know he didn't do that last year, so when they're looking at the tape, I don't think it fits. And then it goes from there. Like they kept mentioning, they want explosiveness from almost any position, but especially defensive line. Someone who can penetrate that backfield, get some of that interior pass rush. Eddie Goldman moving from nose tackle to 3-tech to me doesn't make sense. And I think what I heard here today would kind of align to someone that they saw that can make that cut just due to the film and really the transition. How about you? I have a few others, but who else do you think kind of fits that mold?
Well, I wonder, does Bilal Nichols fit that mold for the 3-tech, being someone that's going to have to move into that role? So does that fit in terms of what Eberflus wants out of the position? We know Alan Williams has spoke highly about the 3-tech, so when he said like explosiveness, can be able to hold the B gap, does Bilal Nichols fit that? And with the tape that he put out last year, and obviously since his rookie season, have Poles and Eberflus seen enough out of him to feel like he can be that guy, or they're going to go address this in the draft or free agency? So it's not really answering your question, but it's like I'm posing another question, like does he fit the mold? And I guess we'll have to wait and see. By maybe free agency will tell us a good indication of that.
More so than Eddie Goldman, but still a good question. They're debating pretty much in-house. What about the offensive line? Sam Mustipher, Cody Whitehair, I think we all would like to move on from a Sam Mustipher. You mentioned, Whitehair could be someone cut to save some money. But do you think it could save him if they go back to previous year's tapes, whether it be him at center or playing guard? Because we all said last year was a bad year, but we do know he did play at higher levels in years past. Do you think that can maybe save him? I know he has a lot of money that's kind of going his way, but just curious your thoughts on maybe like a Cody Whitehair.
Well, the thing is, Ryan Poles also talked about for the offensive line in general, and here's the quote, we got to get lighter, we got to get quicker. And I would think for, a lot of the Bears offensive linemen, I would think they almost they're not the biggest guys. Like the Bears don't have a huge offensive line.
Right.
So, like a Sam Mustipher, I would think almost fits like the quicker and lighter portion of it. But still, you got to see what the tape is telling you in terms of you want to keep a guy like that. But that's going to be the question because you're one also bringing in, they said, different, a little bit in terms of style they're going to change with the offensive line. And then what I thought was an interesting, I guess, quote from Ryan Poles. He said, through that, I think there's some young talent that just needs to be pressed. And that's part of our job is to create competition, to bring the best out of them. I think we'll do that and see if the cream rises to the top there. So
who's the cream?
Who is the cream? Yeah, is the young. So I said when we were kind of walking back from the presser, who's this young talent that needs to be pressed? I told Will, could it be James Daniels? Still a very young player, but has had multiple positions and, hasn't been as consistent as you'd like him to be. But then you mentioned,
both of the bookends, right? Larry Borum and Tevin Jenkins. But when you talk about being pressed, Jenkins didn't even have an opportunity to be pressed last year. Borum was someone who was surprising to kind of play at the level he did. And when you think about James Daniels, they've never brought in anyone that would even threaten him. Like his first year, he would split reps with Eric Gush at the time.
Yeah.
I think, and ever since then, no one's been here to really push him. I do think the inconsistency with positions hurt as well. But that would be someone that would make a lot of sense. And sticking with the offensive line, Poles mentioned they're going to start the best five, and they have no idea what that even looks like. And they were asked about Tevin Jenkins, is he a left tackle? Is he a right tackle? And he was pretty much non-committal. We haven't gotten him on the field. I have some ideas of where he fits on this offensive line, but I need to go out there, work with him and just kind of see how that will kind of come together. Do you think he starts left tackle week 1?
I don't know, Will. But I can say this for certain. That offensive line is switching up. People are going to be in different positions, or they're going to get other players that are going to be filling, a position that was once filled by maybe Larry Borum or Tevin Jenkins because they move them. But from the make of it, from this press conference, even from the introductory one, there's going to be movement along the offensive line, and that can include bringing in new players or just having previous ones playing in maybe positions they should have started off with, like Tevin Jenkins being a right tackle, but who knows, or moving inside. That's for certain. I can guarantee that someone's going to get moved, but to say, is he going to start at left tackle week 1? I honestly have no idea.
And I think, number one, it'll be the fit and what they believe is the best fit. But number 2, if they're going to start the best 5, who do they bring in via free agency? Who can they potentially draft? And that'll also kind of determine the shuffling order, too, because if you can't find a replacement left tackle, then maybe you're, for lack of a better term, stuck. With them there, even though I personally would like him at right tackle. I think that does better suit him, a little less pressure off of him, and he gets to play, I think, a little bit more naturally what we saw with his college tape as well. This one kind of got away from me, so I do want to circle back about the mentality that they're bringing into the Bears, and there's one player that Ryan Poles kind of really highlighted that I think embodies the mentality of what they're trying to bring into Chicago, because they're talking about this Bears offense. When you look back at this offense, what stands out to you? And he mentioned, number 11, Darnell Mooney. And we all know Darnell has really, risen here throughout his time in Chicago. He called Mooney a bright spot on this team, and he was, quote, blown away by Darnell Mooney, the person, as much as he was the player. Talked about the quiet confidence that Mooney likes to kind of go about himself, but also Poles can feel that deep desire to be special in this league. What do you think it means that when Ryan Poles was asked about the entire offense, that he only mentioned, and he talked about Roquan Smith and Justin Fields at other times, so I'll say Justin's also involved here. He talked about the running backs room, but in terms of individuals, what did you like? It was only Darnell Mooney, because to me that speaks volumes about his probably, I would say, lack of faith in some of the current guys on this roster to kind of take those next steps and be true building blocks.
So that tells me, obviously, he loves Darnell Mooney, obviously. But it also tells me like you didn't mention Allen Robinson, who is obviously not signed, and that was supposed to be the number one, right, for the Bears last season, has been the previous years. But saying how glowingly he loved Darnell Mooney, from the person to the player, how he kind of carries himself, wanting to be special, like you mentioned, Will. It also told me, like, yes, I think it's been a foregone conclusion that Allen Robinson's most likely not going to be back. And they asked about, like, his contract. They didn't really give, obviously they can't give much details into it, but it also just, because of how they spoke about Darnell Mooney, you can kind of cut ties and let the Allen Robinson era kind of be over with, which is, sad in itself. But that's what it kind of told me, how I guess confident they were that Darnell Mooney can't be a number one. Like, I mean, with those words that you're kind of saying right here, right now, those sound like a guy that he's going to be obviously a focal point in this offense.
I think number one in today's NFL can mean so many different things. I know in polls they're talking about like wide receivers and what you look for. I know polls said receivers come in all shapes, sizes, speeds. Coach Eberflus mentioned the critical need to have different skill sets at the receiver position. Whether it be a guy who can take the top off the defense, the guy to go win those 50-50 balls, the guy who can take it, that little hitch route and turn it into a 50-yard gain or a screen pass. So. Number one could mean, number one that looks, maybe not number one on the depth chart or playing the X position. But I do think that Poles has, high hopes for Mooney and believes, Mooney played so well and he kept ascending on a roster with a staff that could not develop any talent. So imagine what he can do with a little bit better, teaching as well as a mentality around him. I think that could just even take his ceiling and raise it a little bit more than maybe what it was a year ago.
It speaks volumes to who Darnell Mooney is. To be completely honest, to thrive in that kind of situation they're in. But Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles both mentioned, and you said it here, Will, too, is like what they're looking for in a wide receiver is that being a playmaker. That's huge. And like you said, being able to take a hitch route and get those chunk plays, those explosive plays that really turn the tide and really can change a game. That's what they're looking for, a wide receiver. Whether they target that in free agency or the draft, we'll see very soon. But it's someone that could be a difference maker alongside a Darnell Mooney and a good running back room like Ryan Poles mentioned. So that's going to be the focal point for whoever they bring in to replace Allen Robinson and all the other free agents that they currently have. They're looking for playmakers at the wide receiver position.
And I loved hearing that. Like, it put a big smile on my face to hear it both from Poles and Eberflus, because the fact is, and we've talked about it, exactly number one, the cohesion between the two, but we've talked about it for years on this podcast. Why can't our receivers make plays after the catch? Like, as soon as the ball's in their hands, they're tackled. And at first, like, we're looking at Mitch. Like, maybe Mitch's timing is off, so the defenses are able to kind of respond quicker. And then the same kind of issues happened a year ago. Now, could it be Nagy's scheme? Potentially. But I do think no matter how you look at it, there is that need for more plays after the catch here in Chicago. It could be blocking downfield. There's a lot of variables in play here, but we do need those guys to make something special happen after they have the football in their hands. So you mentioned Mooney, and I also mentioned that Poles brought up both Justin Fields and Roquan Smith, and can't wait to kind of get his hands on those players and raise their ceilings, is how he mentioned that as well. Take their ceilings to the next level. For everyone wondering, Will or Mike, Coach Eberflus said, we don't know yet, but he's going to play inside backer, which obviously we all knew. But when you look at the big three, you have Darnell Mooney, Roquan Smith, and Justin Fields. Obviously, everyone wants us to talk about Justin Fields, so we can here. And Poles said, in order for a quarterback to take a second-year jump, something that really stood out to me was Poles admitting that Justin needs someone he can lean on, someone he can work with all offseason long, throughout training camp, and then when it comes time for game day, someone that he can, quote, battle out with. Nick, obviously that's like a go-to security blanket type of guy. Is that player on the roster as of today?
That's a good question, Will. I think Darnell Mooney showed flash, but he also showed some inconsistencies with some drops. So that's, again, part of the development for him. But I think it's going to be a combination of Darnell Mooney. You have to see what you have in Cole Kmet, but you do definitely need to bring somebody else. So I know we maybe want to make it to one player, but man, it's like in an offense you want to be able to feel comfortable going to your. At first reads taken, like second, third, like you feel confident in it. So I think it's going to be the system, the approach that Luke Getsy kind of brings in to really establish that confidence for Justin Fields. So right now, it would have to, like, if you look at the roster, it's only Darnell Mooney. There's nobody else that can be in contention. But I would feel comfortable if they brought in, on one of those playmakers.
And that's why I told you last week on the show with Mason, I was pissed off when they said, hey, we're going to start Justin, and didn't even involve Jesse James in the game plan, because that was his go-to guy all of camp and all of preseason, and I thought that was an egregious oversight by the previous staff. Moving on with Justin, too, I know Eberflus was talking about him, and something that we talked about in speculation, but we got some good concrete evidence here today, is what I'll quote Eberflus calling that dual education, where he will also be going into the quarterback's room as well and kind of teaching Justin. And we talked about some schemes, like, hey, this is what the defense is running and why. But Flus took it one step further, and he mentioned we're going to look at every DB and the techniques that they're playing with, why they play with those techniques, and some of the vulnerabilities of those techniques. How can we beat not just the coverage, but the specific defender, and depending on the technique that they're using to cover the receiver. What do you take of that? Because that excites me, because I think Justin will be all ears. Someone's going to lean in, and he will grow, I think, tremendously from that kind of mindset and perspective that he probably wasn't getting under Coach Nagy.
No, absolutely. It's just a different perspective on how to look at things, and he wasn't getting that with Matt Nagy. But Matt Eberflus can obviously bring that, and one of the big things, like, oh, you brought in a defensive guy. Well, there's a perspective he can bring, and working alongside Luke Getsy, that dual education will only best prepare Justin Fields for everything he might see, on Sunday. So it is one of the perks of having a defensive-minded coach, which I know a lot of people were very skeptical of, at first. But I think that was something that it's going to play dividends, because you can see all the techniques, the schemes, and why and how they do things. And then if Justin Fields can process that on the field, saying, oh, Matt Eberflus, taught me why they do, they play the certain coverage this way. Well, now you're going to see, I think, a better product on the field from Justin Fields. So I think that's, speaks volumes of the benefits that Matt Eberflus can provide in, the offense.
Right, and I know he was asked a couple times about, have an idea about what a system around Justin looks like? And obviously we're not going to get many details right now, but he mentioned it's going to just be critical to get that ball out fast, make quick decisions, which goes back to the point of having receivers who can make things happen with the ball in their hands if you can get that ball out quick.
One last thing on just Matt Eberflus, and it seems like he's going to be very hands-on. Like he said, after meetings, he would go around and ask how the other positional group meetings went, and just seeing like, hey, how did everything go? But it seems, as the head coach of the organization, having a grasp of everything that's going on, and not so micro focus on only maybe the defense. Obviously, being a defensive-minded coach, but I like that Matt Eberflus is willing, and that's just his personality too. Like, hey, after a meeting, let me go ask, see how things went, and then just getting a better understanding of the entire team, and not just maybe his defensive guys. But I think that's what Matt Eberflus is going to bring to his team, and should reflect in how everybody coaches, and how ultimately how the players play.
100%. And I know we all talked about, the smart kind of mentality that they're all going for, and he was talking up about his defense. He quoted it as, it's easy to understand but hard to implement, meaning that it's hard for a player to play to the high enough level needed in order for this system to scheme to succeed. And I think that's great, because that's going to really create some accountability on that side of the ball. Like, if you're not playing up to a certain standard, like, you're useless in this defense, get off the field, next guy up kind of mentality. So that one was nice. And I know he's building some relationships now via text coaches, which is really all he can do until players can come back into the building, I think, in April for the voluntary workouts. Yep. But he did tell everyone, that everyone has a clean slate right now, and they have fresh grass to walk on, which is nice. Again, you don't want to hold players, accountable for maybe being misused or anything of that nature, but also the fact that you can come in and maybe make a new impression, I think will allow players to approach their new coach, their new regime with an open mind, and maybe playing at that higher level. We're trying, play with something to prove in practice, which is huge.
Yeah, and you have to do that for an entirely new coaching staff. I think it just rejuvenates, the current, maybe some of the guys that were, brought on, like you said, were misused, and maybe we can kind of segue here into someone that we haven't seen in a very long time, but it was very valuable in the old regime, like a Tariq Cohen.
Right.
And he was asked today, Ryan Poles, like, is he healthy now, and didn't want to get into it, but I wonder if a guy like that's going to get an opportunity to prove that he can fit in this regime, or if like the medicals are going to say one thing, but that's obviously a player that was very highly, thought of just a couple years ago, but now is kind of fallen off because of injuries. But I wonder how this all plays out with Tariq Cohen, who, again, Ryan Poles kind of said it's easier to make decisions when you don't have those attachments to the roster, and I wonder if that's one of the casualties of the last regime too.
And what I think concerns me about it, Nick, in terms of like maybe where this is heading, is that we heard from Coach, like, hey, I've been texting players on this team. Ryan Poles said, like, we still need to talk to Tariq Cohen to see where he's at. So if the line of communication isn't open right now, that may also have some writing up on the wall. So let's look forward. We have the Combine coming this week with players coming in, the draft as well as free agency, and they did kind of give some information about that as well. And I want to start with the draft because we're here at the Combine. Poles mentioned, hey, when we're here, we get to see the physicals, right? We get to see how everyone stands out from a physical standpoint, whether it's speed, explosiveness, quickness, just their measurables in general. But more importantly, he said, this is where you can kind of get the insight of what type of person the player is. And going back to the whole mentality of this team, they want players that want to be great, and that's their job here in these interviews, is to kind of weed out, like, who are the players that just want to kind of go to the NFL and be an NFL player versus who are those players that have a deep desire to be something special in this league. And you can find those later in the draft. Darnell Mooney is a perfect example of that, and that's really what they're looking for. Their draft board's pinned down. They roughly know who they want to target and why based off the film, and now it's time to find the differences, who they are as players. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's so big for this current regime right now. It's who are the players, or who are the people behind the players that are making these plays, right? So they emphasize that in the introductory press conferences. They definitely talked about it here, where they just want to get to know the people, and that's going to be, again, a big deciding factor in these. And that's a huge thing with the Combine. You can run a fast 40, you can put so much weight on the bench press multiple times, but who are you as an individual? So all these interviews that are taking place are going to be huge for maybe those fringe prospects that they're thinking maybe fits the profile on multiple different layers, but then the interview may go one way. So if they don't fit that, and the person's not right, the personality, again, wanting to be special, the Bears are not going to get that player, whether it's free agency or the draft. So I think it's crucial what these draft prospects are going to say to maybe their future employer, and if they say the right things and show the right stuff on tape, they could be a Chicago Bear.
And Poles did say, these guys are coached up. They kind of know what to say, and that's their job, to make it hard, ask the tough questions to get the real substance underneath some of the maybe cliches that you will get from some of these prospects this week. Speaking of the draft, he was asked about having only 5 picks. We've been talking about that all offseason so far. He said he will be open-minded in how the Bears can create more picks. What's that mean to you? Is that a trade down? Is that trading players? Is it a combination of the two? I personally doubt it means borrowing from the future and trading next year's picks in order to get more this year. I really don't think that's going to be something on his mind, because just based off of my gut feeling of what he said here today.
I think it's going to be trading back at some point, trying to acquire more picks. But then you also look at what Kansas City kind of did to get blanking on the left tackle that they acquired when they traded, multiple first-round draft picks. So, if there's a conviction there to go acquire somebody, like that last regime, Brett Veach, Ryan Poles, they show that they will do that. But I think as it currently stands with this Bears organization, next year you'll have a first, second, those picks that usually are never there for the Bears because Ryan Pace would trade them away. So I think it is going to be at some point we will see a trade back. That's just my gut saying it. Obviously don't have any information on that, but I just feel like with 5, it really limits you. You have a lot of holes to fill on both sides, offense and defense. So you can find a way, and it takes 2 to tango, right? So you got to find that right trade partner. But I think at some point we see the Bears trade back to acquire some more picks.
And it's going to have to be sooner rather than later, because if you wait till round 5, you're not going to get much in return. Round 3, almost the same boat. So it would have to be number 39, the very first pick, maybe moving down to the mid-40s, low 50s. But if that means you gain a 3rd, maybe a 4th, and maybe maybe another 6th along the way, it may end up being worth it. And then the next phase of this offseason, right after the Combine, is free agency. And Poles mentioned, his mentality through free agency is the fact that he's a big fan of the second and the third waves of free agency. Would kind of hesitate to be a big buyer right away in that first wave. You mentioned free agencies where you overpay for players and for talent anyway. It's a market. It's kind of how it kind of plays out. But it's not just about saving money, Nick. It's about the type of player that they expect to get in the second and third waves, which players at that stage, they're not getting the biggest contracts, maybe not even for the longest amount of time. And they're players, as Poles mentioned, that have a chip on their shoulder. They play with something to prove, and they kind of play with the purpose. And we've seen that in the past with some of Ryan Pace's one-year deals. Yeah. And I kind of expect, for the Bears to be heavy hitters in that second and third wave. I mean, there's so many holes in this roster. If they're not going to be bringing back their own guys, like you have to be buying, some of that back end talent. I know they mentioned like depth is super important, obviously, to kind of build up as well. But I think the fact that they're not going to overspend on the one guy and try to maybe do some quantity here and bring in more players with a similar mindset who will play hard for this team, I think they're going to be able to coach them up and get a lot out of them as well.
Well, I think too, it kind of also connects with that hits philosophy. Those players that you're going to find in second, third waves, like you said, they're proving themselves, and especially if they're on one-year deals, that is their sole focus that year, to prove to this new team that they can stick around for maybe a multi-year contract. So, and that I think fits just right in perfect blueprint of what Matt Eberflus is really expecting out of all of his players, to embody that hits philosophy, that hustle intensity, create turnovers, but smart football. That I think will work well with how they're going to try to build this roster, because you can't just do it through one signing. It's like you can get a quality player with one signing, but then look at all these other holes that you still have to fill. So you have to go this strategy if you really want to fix and have a team that's going to be competitive. You have to do it through these second and third wave and get these one-year deals and see how these players can help the current Bears, because that's what this 1 year most likely is going to be for them, for a lot of the guys. Exactly.
Is there anything that we didn't hear today from either Coach Flus or Poles that you wish we did?
Well, I mean, it would be really nice to get some details on, like, again, what they, even on the offensive line. Like, okay, honestly, where do you kind of see like a James Daniels playing, or a Tariq, or Tevin Jenks, or things like that? But it's too early in the process for that kind of stuff. But it would be nice to just know, like, hey, we're going to move James Daniels, or we're going to move Tevin Jenks. So then we can start looking at players to replace that vacant position. But this is what I was kind of expecting, like not too much information, but just enough to where we can talk about it on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of fun here. Who do you think gave us actually more substance? Would it be Flus or Poles?
I'll go with Poles. I think, just looking at my notes, to be completely honest,
Exactly.
there's just more there. So I'll definitely go with Ryan Poles as being the one who shared a little bit more.
Can I pat myself on the back for asking Coach a question today?
Yes, that's how we were supposed to start this podcast first. Yeah, but it's in the scrum, like with all the podiums, and it's not easy asking a question at any of these like kind of events. But Will spoke up, asked the traits in a corner. Back.
Yeah, Coach thought I said quarterback. Yeah, like quarterback in your defense. Is it quarterback? And then did like a little throwing motion. I was like, no, corner. He's like, oh, big difference. I'm like, yeah, a little bit. But he did mention, like, when he's looking at corners in his defense, three things: quickness because they need to get to the ball, quickness into transitions, instincts, which means ball instincts. They want ball hawks on this defense, and speed. Like, for instance, make-up speed, because sometimes you are going to get beat, but your ability to kind of close that gap and recover is important. So those are the three things, which, by the way, I don't think Duke Shelley embodies. Kendall Vildor, iffy. So I feel like we're in the market for corner. And as we look throughout the rest of our week, in terms of like who we want to talk to and why, I know some traits that I get to kind of highlight here.
Yeah, absolutely. Knowing those traits came from Will's question, which is pretty cool in itself.
100%, man. So looking ahead for this week, obviously we have a lot of work ahead of us. Tomorrow we get to talk to the wide receivers and tight ends, which we all know are two positions of need in one degree or another. It really depends on the Cole Kmet evaluation as well. He was not a guy mentioned whatsoever here today, so take that for what it's worth. So guys, and Nick, we'll have the opportunity to kind of talk to some players like David Bell from Purdue, Alec Pierce out of Cincinnati, USC's Drake London. Who are you most excited to listen to and kind of pick the brain, and why?
So I really like David Bell, and I know there's some people who are concerned with like how fast he is, how fast he's going to run, and things like that. But the person, again, they got to fit this certain type that Ryan Poles, Matt Eberflus are looking for. So again, know him a little bit more. And he does model his game after Allen Robinson. That's kind of the guy that he looks up to and how he kind of plays his game. But I'm really just looking forward to, just getting to ask him a couple of questions tomorrow. But Alec Pierce, too, as well, is another guy that I just briefly spoke to at the Senior Bowl, but just kind of catching up with him a little bit. Those are definitely the two I'm looking for.
I'm looking forward to a Drake London. Again, as Eberflus mentioned, the receivers in his offense need to have complementary skill sets. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to be looking at other Darnell Mooney type of players. They could draft one and prove me wrong here, but I feel like they're going to be looking at, what does Mooney not have that we still need? Is it the bigger, taller guy that can go down there and win those, 50-50 balls on the perimeter? I think so, Nick. So I'll be looking at, guys over 6 foot, guys who can go up and get it at the point of attack, and I have a nice short list. I'm excited to kind of hammer out here tomorrow and hop back on the show to talk to you about and share with you, what I learned. You can share it to me, the same kind of thing, and it'll be a great conversation. But any final thoughts before we wrap up today's episode?
Day one is in the books, and it's only going to become even more extensive from now on, but we're really looking forward to providing all this coverage. So keep your notifications on for the Chicago Audible. We don't know when we'll be going live, but just make sure you're on your phones, laptops, whatever it may be, and stay up to date with everything that's going on here at the NFL Scouting Combine.
Right. We do know we're going live Friday morning. That's a big, big day for us as we kind of finish our transition to our new brand with a bigger company that we're super excited to be a part of now, allowing us to kind of cover the Bears full-time. If you haven't heard that yet, the Chicago Audible, we have been acquired, so we will be under a different name. Still Will and Nick, some other people along the way. But Friday morning, if you get a notification from maybe a name you don't know yet, you'll at least figure it out. I believe shouldn't be too hard. And then from there, give it a look. Because I'm just going to say it. It's going to be badass.
Oh, it definitely is. If you need to tune in on Friday, just going to say it straight up. Once you see that notification, hop on. Because it's going to be awesome. So I cannot wait for that at the end of the week. After all this work, then we kind of get rewarded, right? So it's going to be a really good time.
Hey, by the way, I know we got to see each other in person to meet, the new boss and, kind of get some ducks in a row here. But first time on the show in person together, which I think will be happening more and more in our future. But I just want to say congratulations
Congrats, man.
Everything that we've been able to accomplish. And I so look forward to this next chapter with you, being one of my best friends for years, a colleague here on the show. Being able to now have a more professional relationship with you is on the Bears beat. It's another dream come true, and I can't wait till we're 50 and look back at this moment. It's going to be such a turning point for us in our lives, and I think we'll just look back at it fondly and not wonder what if, because we made the right choice.
Absolutely, and years of hard work, dedication, but it's also thanks to everybody who tunes in to all these shows and has helped us throughout the years just grow and given us this opportunity, this pursuing our dreams, which is awesome to say. So thank you to everybody who watches and listens and supports us through over the years.
Right. So I only get to say this for a couple more times. I want to thank you for tuning into this episode of the Chicago Audible. Again, it's going to be so weird having to say other things here soon, but again, it's your support over the years that made everything possible for us. I just want to thank you for tuning into this episode, getting our thoughts on Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus' time with the media here today. And I look forward, alongside with Nick, to kind of give you some insights from all of the positions here this week, besides linebacker and defensive line, because we will be in Chicago that day, spoiler alert, for that new show. So I think it's just good that you know that, so you don't look for that come Friday. But Mason will be here, so you can follow Mason on Twitter, and he'll give you all the updates throughout the day as well. But that's going to do it. I'm your host, Will Dewitt, for Nicholas Moreano. Until next time, bear down, Chicago.
I'm going to go turn it off now.
Sounds good.